It began with a disruption, a moment of chaos. A confrontation was brewing inside the small house. A fragile peace was about to be shattered. The situation escalated quickly. There was shouting. Then, a fatal silence. This is the story of 18-year-old Cassidy Jackson, a young mother who was shot and killed in her own home, allegedly after attempting to end a relationship by blocking her ex on social media. On the afternoon of January 8, 2026, emergency dispatchers received a call reporting a shooting during a domestic dispute at a residence on the 1700 block of Columbus Dunn Drive. By the time law enforcement arrived on the scene, Cassidy had already been transported to a local hospital, suffering from a single gunshot wound to the chest. She would not survive her injuries. Just hours earlier, the home had been a sanctuary for Cassidy, her new girlfriend, and her young child. She had believed that she had successfully distanced herself from a past relationship that had grown dangerously controlling. But to understand how a simple act of self-preservation could culminate in such irreversible violence, one must examine the events that led to that tragic afternoon. This is the life and death of Cassidy Jackson. Born on October 27, 2007, her life was extinguished at the age of 18. She was at a stage of life where most individuals are still navigating the uncertain terrain of their own identity. Those who knew her paint a portrait of a gentle and soft-spoken individual, a person who instinctively avoided conflict and sought comfort in calm, familiar environments. She possessed a goofy and endearing charm. She was described as being full of life, a young entrepreneur who channeled her creativity into doing hair, makeup, and eyelashes, a burgeoning hustler. She did not seek out attention or drama. Her primary focus was on achieving a sense of stability. Yet from an early age, it was evident that Cassidy's life was being shaped by responsibilities far beyond her years. Cassidy maintained a close connection to her family, who served as an essential support system while she adapted to the demands of motherhood at a young age. While many of the more personal details of her childhood are not public knowledge, her actions as a young adult demonstrated a profound sense of care and maturity. As Cassidy worked to build her future, one pivotal event would alter the course of her life forever. At one point, she had been involved in a relationship with a young man whose name has not been officially released to the public. It began as a typical teenage romance, but the dynamic shifted irrevocably when Cassidy became pregnant. The immense pressure of this life change, coupled with their youth, proved to be too much for the relationship to sustain. It dissolved, leaving Cassidy with the profound responsibility of raising a child on her own. On October 22, 2022, Cassidy gave birth. From the moment she held her baby, it was clear that she embraced the role of motherhood with absolute seriousness. Her child became the center of her universe, and she would occasionally share glimpses of their life online, openly proud of the parent she had become. Becoming a mother was a catalyst for rapid personal growth, giving her life a new and urgent focus. She understood that her choices now carried a weight they never had before. Every decision was filtered through the lens of its consequence for the small life that was completely dependent on her. That powerful sense of responsibility informed her approach to her education. Cassidy continued to attend school while raising her child, balancing academics with the relentless duties of parenting. It was an incredibly difficult balance, but she remained committed. She knew that finishing school and acquiring marketable skills were essential to providing more opportunities for her family's future. Even at her young age, she was thinking strategically about income, security, and the creation of a peaceful home environment for her child. She was navigating the complexities of adulthood in real time, without the luxury of making mistakes that carried no significant cost. This drive for independence propelled her into the workforce. Cassidy found work as a hairstylist, a profession that not only allowed her to earn an income but also to cultivate her own self-confidence. It was a craft she excelled at. Friends and former clients remember her as someone who took genuine pleasure in making other people feel good about their appearance. Her workstation was more than a place of business. For Cassidy, styling hair was a tangible expression of her own capability and a step towards self-sufficiency. She took deep pride in earning her own money, viewing it as a direct contribution to her child's well-being and future. As she skillfully managed the dual roles of mother and professional, a new development entered Cassidy's life, one that would ultimately prove fatal. At some point during 2025, Cassidy began to explore romantic relationships with women. It was a personal journey of self-discovery, one that occurred as she was still defining who she was and the kind of life she wanted to lead. That path led her to a relationship with 19-year-old Paulia Banks, a woman whose presence would irrevocably alter the course of Cassidy's life. In the beginning, the relationship was characterized by an overwhelming intensity of attention and affection that made Cassidy feel acknowledged and valued. Like many relationships forged in youth, it progressed at a rapid and breathless pace. The relationship began with an intensity that, at first, felt like intimacy. For Cassidy, a young mother, it seemed as if she had found someone who truly saw her, an accepting partner who understood her world. But this illusion of acceptance soon began to crumble as the weeks wore on, revealing a darker undercurrent. Observers, including friends and later law enforcement, would come to characterize the dynamic as profoundly toxic. Banks's affection soured into obsession. Her behavior became a suffocating web of jealousy and control, marked by relentless calls, incessant check-ins, and a psychological pressure that left Cassidy feeling cornered, not cherished. The very closeness she had once craved was now constricting her, becoming an emotional cage. A disturbing realization began to dawn on Cassidy. The relationship was eroding her peace, not nurturing it. That quiet understanding grew into an undeniable truth she could no longer suppress. She was in a place of emotional peril. Her responsibilities as a mother made the stakes impossibly high. She required stability, not the chaos that was consuming her life. The need for safety eclipsed the unpredictable turmoil, leading her to make the choice that experts so often advise in such circumstances. Just before the new year of 2026, Cassidy severed the ties. It was a move to reclaim her tranquility, a decision that would, tragically and unknowingly, seal her fate. Cassidy's position was unequivocal. The connection was over, and she was determined to move forward with her life. But when Banks persisted with unwanted contact, Cassidy erected a digital wall, blocking her on all social media platforms, including TikTok. For Cassidy, this act was not born of malice. It was a necessary act of self-preservation, a clear and definitive boundary to create the distance she desperately needed. Her priority was the well-being of her child and her own mental peace. But this healthy boundary was perceived as an unforgivable slight. Police records would later show that being blocked ignited a rage in Banks, a fury that did not diminish over time. On the contrary, it festered and grew. Investigators concluded that Banks became pathologically fixated on what she interpreted as the ultimate rejection. Instead of accepting the finality of the breakup, Banks viewed the boundary not as an ending, but as a challenge to be overcome. That obsession became a turning point. In the wake of the breakup, Cassidy cautiously started a new relationship. This new chapter offered a sense of calm and security that had been absent for so long. It was a world away from the corrosive jealousy and psychological pressure that had defined her recent past. A profound sense of relief washed over Cassidy. She believed she had escaped the toxic dynamic, and for the first time in a long time, her life felt like her own again. But as Cassidy began to heal, Banks remained trapped in a prison of resentment, unable to move on. Investigators would later uncover an intense, almost visceral reaction to being digitally cut off. Arrest records document Banks's own admission. The realization that she was blocked triggered a powerful emotional response, one that refused to remain internal. That turmoil soon metastasized into action. It was the moment the situation crossed an invisible but critical threshold from emotional distress to physical threat. In Cassidy's mind, she had done everything right. She had created distance and erected barriers she thought would ensure her safety. She had followed the conventional wisdom for leaving a toxic relationship, believing that escape was a guarantee of protection. She was tragically unaware that the person she was attempting to leave in her past had already breached the line between obsession and intent. Just as a sense of normalcy returned to her life, a volatile, unresolved anger was quietly escalating into something far more sinister. The culmination of that rage was already in motion, making its way inexorably toward her front door. On the afternoon of January 8, 2026, shortly before 2 p.m., Cassidy was home on the 1700 block of Columbus Dunn Drive near Gus Young Avenue with her new girlfriend and her young child. It was an utterly unremarkable day, devoid of any drama or premonition. It was the sort of quiet afternoon where one feels an implicit sense of security, simply by virtue of being in their own home. She was living the life she had fought to create, a quiet existence centered on her child in the company of those she trusted. But the sanctuary she had built was about to be violated. Sometime that afternoon, A knock came at the door. There was no reason for alarm. She was in her own home, protected, she thought, by the presence of loved ones. When she opened it, 3 individuals forced their way into the apartment. Police reports confirmed that one of them was her ex-girlfriend, Pelasia Banks. In an instant, the peace was shattered. An argument erupted in the kitchen, its verbal fury escalating with terrifying speed. Weeks of simmering tension now stood face to face in the small room, with no digital screens or physical distance to act as a buffer. The shouting intensified, and then the confrontation violently breached the physical barrier. Instinctively, Cassidy's girlfriend moved to protect the child, pulling them from the room and away from the escalating chaos. That protective act likely saved a second life. Moments after she left, the sharp report of a single gunshot echoed through the apartment. Returning to the kitchen, she discovered Cassidy collapsed on the floor, a gunshot wound to her chest. She was bleeding profusely, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Paramedics were summoned, and Cassidy was transported to Our Lady of the Lake Hospital. But despite the efforts of the medical team, her life could not be saved. Cassidy Jackson was pronounced dead shortly after she arrived at the hospital. She was only 18 years old. According to law enforcement, both incidents were rooted in domestic conflict. Tonight, an inside look at what investigators are uncovering in both cases and what domestic violence advocates say can be done to help someone escape a volatile relationship. Twice within a 24-hour period, 2 separate lives were violently extinguished in Baton Rouge. Authorities report that in each case, what began as a verbal dispute between acquaintances spiraled into deadly violence. It's difficult to fathom the kind of terror that accompanies witnessing someone you love in mortal danger right before your eyes. On Thursday, chaos erupted on Columbus Dunn Drive. 18-year-old Cassidy Jackson was shot and killed inside her own home. Investigators say 19-year-old Pelasia Banks, Jackson's former girlfriend, appeared uninvited at the residence, leading to a heated confrontation between the two. That altercation escalated, and soon after, police report that Banks surrendered to authorities. As detectives began to assemble the sequence of events, the chilling reality of the situation came into sharp focus. Police would later reveal that Banks confessed her anger was triggered by the discovery that Cassidy had blocked her on social media. The arrest warrant alleges that Banks first located a man within her neighborhood. From him, she borrowed a handgun, then enlisted 2 other individuals before proceeding to Cassidy's residence, where the firearm reportedly slipped from her waistband during the confrontation. As Cassidy attempted to force her from the house, the door slammed between them. Banks then discharged the weapon through the closed door. The projectile passed through the wood, entered the kitchen, and fatally struck Cassidy in the chest. In an instant, a simple act of creating emotional distance resulted in an irreversible tragedy. Following the shooting, Banks vanished from the scene. There was no emergency call placed, no attempt to provide aid, and no effort to control the bleeding. Cassidy's death left a child to navigate life without a mother. Her family was shattered by a loss that never should have happened, while the community grappled with how something so common could escalate to something so final. But the crime would not go unsolved. On the very day of the shooting, Pelasia Banks turned herself in to law enforcement. Investigators launched into formal interrogations, meticulously documenting her version of the events. Their inquiry, however, reached far beyond the single, fatal moment the trigger was pulled. They scrutinized the entire chain of choices that culminated in Cassidy's death: how the gun was procured, why accomplices were present, and fundamentally, why Banks chose to confront Cassidy at her home rather than simply walking away. Every piece of evidence pointed to a singular, disturbing pattern. It was a case of rejection that could not be accepted. Police concluded that Banks was enraged upon realizing Cassidy had blocked her online and was moving on with her life. That rage, according to investigators, transformed into a calculated plan of action. Instead of acknowledging Cassidy's boundaries, Banks armed herself, gathered associates, and went to Cassidy's home. Authorities were quick to emphasize that Cassidy was not the aggressor. She was in the sanctuary of her home, attending to her child, when violence arrived at her doorstep. With this critical understanding of the dynamics at play, police officially classified the crime as a domestic violence homicide and formally charged Banks in the killing of Cassidy Jackson. Though the long legal battle was only just beginning, Banks faced a charge of second-degree murder, which under Louisiana statute signifies an intentional killing. The prosecution's position was unequivocal. This was neither a random act of violence nor a tragic accident. It was the culmination of escalating behavior, fueled by jealousy, a need for control, and a complete refusal to accept the end of the relationship. In court proceedings, investigators methodically laid out how the situation devolved after Cassidy terminated the relationship and severed all contact. The case became a stark illustration of how rapidly emotional obsession can metastasize into physical violence when personal boundaries are disregarded. A conviction for second-degree murder in Louisiana carries a mandatory sentence: life in prison, with no possibility of parole. According to the most recent public records available, that charge is still active, and there has been no official announcement of a plea agreement or a reduction in charges. As the case navigated the complexities of the judicial system, Cassidy's family was left to grieve amidst the glare of public scrutiny. A mother is grappling with the profound loss of her daughter, who police say was murdered inside her own home just last week. However, the attorney for the accused presents a starkly different narrative, insisting the shooting was a tragic accident, a version of events the victim's family vehemently rejects. Reporter Deshaun Johnson spoke exclusively with that mother in an interview you will only see on Louisiana First News. Deshaun: "That's right, Ashley. Devastika Jackson described to me a state of profound shock. It's a pain compounded by the assertions that the gunshot that claimed her daughter's life was nothing more than an accident. They took my girl," she said. "That was my oldest child." On January 8th, 19-year-old Pelasia Banks allegedly ended the life of 18-year-old Cassidy Jackson at her residence, firing a weapon through a side door after a reported confrontation with Cassidy's new girlfriend. Authorities quickly labeled the incident as domestic in nature, a conclusion supported by Devastika Jackson, who confirmed the two had been in a relationship for some time. Jackson recounts that she was not present when the tragedy unfolded, learning of the horrifying event through a frantic phone call from her sister. According to Jackson, her sister was the one who made the grim discovery, finding Cassidy's body in the kitchen, with her young son nearby. She describes a feeling of being completely shattered, struggling to find words to articulate the depth of her pain. In the midst of their grief, a wave of frustration washed over the family after a statement from Pelasia Banks' attorney surfaced, claiming the shooting was purely accidental. This raised a chilling question. Was this truly a tragic mistake? The family vehemently rejected this narrative, pointing out the premeditation involved, the time taken to drive to the location, the effort to acquire a firearm, and the decision to bring her brothers along. From their perspective, the chain of events made the claim of an accident completely implausible. Jackson insisted she never could have foreseen such a violent turn. To her, Pelasia had always presented a pleasant demeanor in their few interactions. The thought that she was capable of such an act was something Jackson could never have imagined. Jackson remembers her daughter as a vibrant young woman who was always eager to assist others and was determined to seize every opportunity life offered. She was described as goofy and full of life, a young entrepreneur or baby hustler who was skilled in doing hair, makeup, and eyelashes. Now, that promising life has been brutally cut short. Jackson and her family are now steeling themselves for a difficult fight for justice, vowing to attend every court date wearing yellow shirts emblazoned with Cassidy's picture and the message "Justice for Cassidy, Forever 18." A silent, powerful testament, forcing the accused to face the family that was destroyed. The news of Cassidy's death sent shockwaves of devastation not only through Baton Rouge but far beyond the city limits. A collective sense of disbelief hung in the air, as many struggled to comprehend how a seemingly simple act like blocking someone on social media could escalate to such a fatal conclusion. Her family made it clear they wanted Cassidy remembered not as a statistic, but as a dedicated young mother striving to build a better life for herself and her child. She was navigating the difficult path of early adulthood, balancing her education, a job, and the immense responsibilities of parenting. The choices she made were all geared toward creating a safe and stable environment for her son. That child, now left to navigate the world without his mother, stands as a quiet, heartbreaking symbol of all that was taken. Cassidy's death was not just the end of a life. It was the violent interruption of a future she was actively and diligently building. The case forced a harsh spotlight on the often overlooked warning signs of escalating danger in relationships. Behaviors like relentless calling, intense jealousy, and an obsessive refusal to accept a breakup are frequently dismissed as mere emotional outbursts. But Cassidy had recognized the threat they posed. She had taken steps to protect herself. She terminated the relationship. She blocked all contact, and she attempted to create physical and digital distance. But that distance proved to be insufficient. Her story became a chilling entry in a much larger, darker conversation about how rejection can detonate into violence when an individual feels entitled to another person's time, attention, and very presence. In the somber days that followed the incident, Cassidy's family and loved ones convened to bid her a final farewell. While the details of her funeral remained private, attendees described a service saturated with emotion, centered on the profound love she held for her child. A sea of candles, flowers, and messages of sorrow appeared, tributes from a community determined to honor the life she lived rather than the violence that so senselessly ended it. Prayers were offered for a divine blessing to strengthen everyone connected to the tragedy, asking for a higher power to grant them strength and peace. A special plea was made for the child, asking for protection and guidance. The hope was that he would grow to live a productive life, despite the shadow of his loss, a prayer sealed in the name of Jesus. As balloons were released into the sky, it was a symbolic surrender, a prayer for them to travel where a higher power intended. The air was filled with quiet affirmations of faith. Voices thick with emotion called out their love for Cassidy, a final, heartbreaking goodbye to a cherished niece. Amid the grief, the portrait of Cassidy that emerged was one of a gentle and devoted soul, singularly focused on crafting a peaceful future for her son. Even in her absence, her identity as a mother remained the core of her legacy. Her story serves as a stark and painful reminder that ending a relationship does not always signify the end of the danger, and that warning signs must be taken with the utmost seriousness, never downplayed or dismissed. If you or anyone you know is facing controlling behaviors, obsession, or fear after a breakup, it is critical to seek help. It is vital to speak to someone, to document the events as they happen, and to always trust your intuition. The complexities of this case invite reflection. We encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. If this account resonated with you, please show your support by liking and sharing this video, and be sure to subscribe for more in-depth stories. The tragic story of Cassidy Jackson is more than a headline. It is a profound lesson in the sanctity of boundaries and the devastating cost of a love that turns into an obsession. At only 18, Cassidy chose growth over chaos. She embraced the weight of motherhood and the pursuit of a peaceful future, doing everything right to escape a toxic dynamic. She built a digital and emotional wall, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for self-preservation. The heartbreaking truth we must face is that, for some, a healthy boundary is perceived as an act of war. This story serves as a stark reminder that rejection is never a justification for violence. We must educate our communities to recognize that love does not suffocate, and true intimacy cannot exist where there is a need for control. The red flags we often dismiss, relentless check-ins, explosive jealousy, and the refusal to accept no, are the quiet precursors to irreversible tragedy. Let Cassidy's legacy be a catalyst for change. We must empower the next generation to trust their intuition and speak up before the silence becomes fatal. To honor Cassidy is to realize that safety is a fundamental right, and no one should ever pay with their life for the simple act of walking away. Let us vow to protect the Cassidys of the world, ensuring that a boundary meant to save a life never again leads to the end of one.